This is an oral history project for the Archives of Iowa Broadcasting. It is October 11th, 2022. With me today is Dave Madsen of Morningside College. I'm Cliff Brockman, by the way, of Wartburg, and our producer is Paul Yeager of Iowa PBS. Dave, thanks for being with us today. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Absolutely. It'll be fun to sit and talk for a little while.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. We'll get to Morningside College in a little bit, but let's start with your professional career. 33 years is what I counted, at least over 30 anyway.
Yeah.
And you started down at the bottom, as I recall, a master control operator.
Yeah, that was when I was, that was between my junior and senior year at the university. I went to the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And so it was basically called an internship, but it was a part-time job. It was a full-time job over the summer at the station in Kearney. And I was a master control operator / director for their morning news. I mean, and talk about early days of television. The news department at that station at the time shot 8mm film. And so they would have to load up the 8mm film, for us to play in the morning when they would do their like news cut-ins in the Today Show. That's mostly the time when I was working. And then the other thing, we didn't have anybody in the studio. I was in the control room and there wasn't anybody in the studio. So the person, and we didn't have an IFB system at all. So I would just take a stopwatch and put it under the camera of the teleprompter, because at the time it was, you had to feed paper through a teleprompter, and he didn't use the teleprompter. So I would put that stopwatch there so he could tell how much time he had left. So I mean, it was pretty basic, working there, but it was really cool to get involved in all the different kinds of things that went on at the TV station. So, but it was just a 3 month time, basically a summer job.
Okay. Let me back up just a minute. How did you get interested in broadcasting?
I can remember growing up, always thinking that what I wanted to do was work at a television station. I remember even when I was in high school, walking into one of the TV stations. I'm from Omaha, and walking into one of the TV stations in Omaha and saying, do you have any part-time jobs? I mean, even somebody to sweep the floors, I'd be willing to do that. So I don't know why, but I just always had that interest. I always thought that broadcasting is kind of where I wanted to be. But when I was graduating high school and going to go to the University of wherever I was going to go to school, and I was pretty sure I was going to go to the University of Nebraska, my plan was I was going to double major in chemistry and journalism, because I was pretty sure I was a pretty decent writer and I really liked chemistry in high school. And so I said, this will be kind of cool. I can go work for one of those journals, those educational journals, like at MIT, for example. I could go write for them. Until I took my first chemistry class in college and said, okay, stop that. No more of that. And so I just said, well, we'll just do the journalism thing. And so I was at the University of Nebraska, you have to decide, do you want to be on what they called the news editorial side, which was just kind of basic newspaper journalism, or on the broadcasting side. And I didn't know enough about the broadcasting side. So I did the newspaper side, the news editorial, until I took a introduction to broadcasting course and said, oh, this is way more fun. So let's do this. So that's how I got into broadcasting, really, was by about the time I was a sophomore at the university, made that decision and decided broadcasting was the way that I wanted to go.
Okay. Well, then you ended up at, in Omaha as a broadcast journalist for about a year, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was while I was a senior at the university. Oh, okay. And I was doing, it was really a part-time job working in the news department at KTIV-TV in Omaha. And it was just working weekends, and I would go cover whatever needed to get covered, for the weekend. And that's what we were shooting, 16 millimeter film at the time. And so I didn't know enough about using the camera. So I had to learn a lot kind of right away. And I'd get sent out to do all kinds of things. I remember one of the first thing I did was go cover a high school football game and had to shoot a bunch of film. And then, of course, then bring the film back and have the film processed before it could go on the air at 10 o'clock. And so I did that. And I did that for when I was a senior. And basically it was called kind of an internship also, but it was just a part-time job for the whole time of my senior year. So when I graduated, they offered me a full-time job as a videographer, although they didn't call it a videographer at the time because they were still shooting film, a full-time job as a news photographer. And I wasn't sure I wanted to do that. I kind of liked the journalism side a little more, the writing and stuff. But then about the same time, I got a call from the placement office at the University of Nebraska, and they said, well, we have this, there's a job we know about up in Sioux City, Iowa, you might want to check out. And it's writing promotional announcements for a TV station up there. I said, well, I'll check it out because I don't want to full-time be a photographer. And so I came to Sioux City and checked out the job that was at KTIV-TV, the CBS affiliate. As it was called assistant promotion director, and basically writing promotional announcements for the television station. Knew nothing about Sioux City. Like a whole lot of college students, I came to Sioux City thinking, well, I'll stay here for a year or two and then go on to something bigger, like I'll go work in Minneapolis. That was always the place I thought I'd want to go. And now I've been here like 46 years. So I don't know if that's called stuck in a rut or not, but so that's how I got to Sioux City and started working at KMEG Television.
Sure. Well, and then you moved over to KTIV, kind of across town and up north a little bit, I guess.
Yeah. Let me tell you just a little bit about KMEG first. It was interesting because when I first got to KMEG, one of the things that KMEG decided to do, this would have been in 1976, so the fall of 1976, was one of the first things that the station did was decided that they couldn't compete in the news arena against the other stations in Sioux City, the ABC and the NBC station. So they got rid of all their news, and instead having regular newscasts like at 10 o'clock, they just had little news updates, like 60-second news and weather updates.
I remember that.
And so I got to work for a little bit with news, but then they got rid of the complete newscast, and some of the people at the station, of course, left. People in the Omaha area might remember Dave Weber. He was a sports director at WOWT for a long time in Omaha. Well, he started at KMEG, and he was the sports director at KMEG, and also did a kids show at KMEG, and I was the producer of that kids show. And then when he was going to leave, I had made an appearance as a clown, as a guest on his kids show. And then I took over the kids show when he left. So I did a kids show called Bingo's Big Top. That was, it ran, I was Bingo the Clown. It ran Monday through Friday at 3:30. We'd record a whole weeks of shows at one time, because it was mostly intros to like Little Rascals movies. And I'd have an audience of kids come in, and I'd have guests come in and stuff. So I did that for a couple of years there. I talked about those news updates. I also did those because it was kind of like, oh, who's around that can do these little news updates? So I did those. So I was an on-air personality doing news, but I was also an on-air personality being the clown doing the kids show. So that was a strange kind of combination, I guess you would say.
That is pretty strange. Yeah.
And I'm still doing the clown stuff, by the way, not as a TV show, but I teach a class here at Morningside. We have a thing called May Term. And every 3 years, faculty teaches a May term course. And I teach a course on magic and clowning and how to be a clown and put on clown makeup and learn how to make balloon animals and learn how to juggle and do magic tricks and stuff. So I still have my fingers in it just a little bit.
Well, that sounds like fun. Yeah. What a great deal.
It is it's a fun class.
Well, then to KTIV, where you spent probably the bulk of your professional career.
Yeah. 29 years.
Okay.
Yeah. I was at 29 years at KTIV, and it kind of happened. as I'm not sure exactly, well, I know how it happened, but it wasn't that I was thinking, well, I need to go move from KMEG. I was happy doing what I was doing at KMEG, but a friend of mine was the production manager at KTIV. And I knew he had left KTIV to go on to something else, still here in town, going to banking actually. And I was talking to him one day and I said, have they filled your job yet? And he said, no, are you interested? And I said, well, I never thought about that. And he said, well, you ought to apply. So I applied for the job of production manager at KTIV and I got that job. And so I started kind of behind the scenes, organizing directors and audio people and camera operators and that kind of thing. And that's what I did at KTIV for a little while. And eventually I moved. Then there was a position open in the promotion department at KTIV. So I moved to be the promotion director at KTIV. Then there was an opportunity to move into more kind of station operations, which kind of overseeing the production and creative services and promotion folks. So I moved into that position of operations and programming. So I got a whole lot of great experience in terms of doing programming and at the station. And then eventually I actually had a job opportunity in Rapid City where they were going to start a brand new station. And a former general manager at KTIV asked me, would I be interested in thinking about that job in Rapid City as the general manager of this new station? So he flew me out there and I interviewed for that job, but decided it wasn't a time that I would want to be moving. I was married by then. I think I might have had one of our kids by then. So it didn't make sense. Came back to just stayed at Sioux City at KTIV and eventually became station manager, overseeing the whole operation at the TV station.
Sure. So you worked your way up, you had all that knowledge that you gained all the way up. So then you were able to, really relate, know what the situation was in the various departments. Did you enjoy being the station manager?
I did. And one of my favorite things was talking to people, talking to the viewers, even though a lot of times when viewers would call the station, it was to complain about something. Yeah. Very, very rarely does somebody call the station and say, boy, you're doing a great job. Most of it's like, why did you put that program on or whatever it is? But I really enjoyed doing that. Plus, while I was station manager, was the time when stations were making the switch to digital television. And one of the responsibilities of television stations were that you had to do some education to your viewers. I mean, the FCC said you have to do some education to let the viewers know about the switch to digital television. And so I was that person. And I would go out to little communities around our area and explain what digital TV was going to be about and that they were going to have to get a new television or get one of these converter boxes. And I really enjoyed doing that. And I'd have my little PowerPoint presentation that I'd take along with me. And I just would make this little presentation. And I really loved doing that. So in addition to kind of overseeing the station, I really enjoyed being a part of the community, telling people about digital television. And then because I was station manager, you get into things like I was on the board for the Chamber of Commerce here, for example. And I joined the Rotary Club, for example. I'm still a member of Rotary. So, I mean, you get into those kind of things and become more a part of the community. So that's so I really did enjoy my time doing that.
Well, then KTIV was owned by Blackhawk Broadcasting. I think they were sold probably a little before you became station manager.
No, I worked when I first, before I became station manager. Yeah. When I first started, they were owned by Blackhawk Broadcasting, right. And it was sold to Aflac, the insurance people, the cancer insurance folks. Sure. And so then it was owned by Aflac for a while. And then it was sold to the Quincy Newspapers Group from Quincy, Illinois. And so that's who owned the station for most of the time when I was there, for the last lots of years while I was there. Mm-hmm. They just recently have been, the Quincy Group then sold all their stations, and KTIV is now owned by Gray Television.
Right. Yeah. Just so people know, I worked at KCAU for a couple of years back in the early 80s while you were at KTIV. I don't think you were station manager at that time.
No,
But so anyway, we decided that we have met somewhere along the way, probably way back then. So
Yep, probably you're right.
When Blackhawk owned KTIV, there was some sort of sports network, wasn't there? Do you remember that?
Yeah, that was so way back. This was in the time of, if people remember the term must see TV on NBC, because KTIV is the NBC station. And must see TV was like Thursday nights were the big night. That's when the Cosby Show was on, and everybody watched television on NBC on Thursday nights. Well, the Blackhawk group decided, we should do some broadcasting of Iowa basketball, because it's becoming a bigger thing. And so through they had a remote production unit that was based in Waterloo, which was another station owned by Blackhawk. And so they made an arrangement with Iowa basketball to broadcast all of their, not all, most of their home games, Iowa basketball games. The weird thing about it was they were on Thursday nights. So what does that mean when it's one of our biggest nights of television, and we're going to have to preempt that to be able to have basketball on? But we did that. And we had to go to the network and say, we're going to preempt some of this great must-see TV Thursday night stuff to run Iowa basketball. But it was real successful, especially in those early years. It made a lot of money for all of the Blackhawk stations. It was really successful, and because it hadn't happened before, there hadn't been broadcasting of Iowa basketball. And so it went on for several years and was really very well received by most people. Of course, that'd be some of the people who would call and complain about missing some of their Thursday night programming. So sometimes we would preempt programming and move it to a different time, like later in the evening. But eventually then they stopped doing the broadcast of Iowa basketball because they got other ways to do Iowa basketball. And then our station didn't do it anymore.
Back then, when I was there, KTIV and KCAU were very competitive, and really pretty close to one another. And then eventually KTIV really took off and became really the dominant station, still is there, I think.
Yeah, it is.
What, especially in news, what did you do to accomplish that?
I'm not going to take credit for it, but I can tell you I was there when that happened, because you're right. For the longest time, they were competitive, although KCAU was definitely a number one station for many, 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 many years. And so if you looked at a chart of viewers, here was KCAU, the ABC station, and it was going down just a little bit. And here's KTIV, and it was going up just a little bit. And in 1983, they switched, and then KTIV started moving up, and KCAU went down. So I was there then, but like I said, I'm not going to take credit for doing that. But I think we just kind of kept pushing forward. We were the first to actually have to shoot video in news instead of shooting film. So we were the first to do that at KTIV. I can't put a finger on it, but I just know we kept pushing along. Those were the early days. Those were days when NBC was really popular also. And so I think that helped a lot, because all of a sudden we had really great primetime programming from NBC that of course then would lead into our 10 o'clock newscast. So I think some of that helped also.
Little aside here, I guess when I was at KCAU, the general manager was Bill Turner. And then I left, and shortly after that, he left when there was an ownership change, but then he ended up at KTIV. Did you work for Bill?
Absolutely. Bill came when the Quincy group took over from American Family, from the Aflac group. When the Quincy group took over, they hired Bill Turner to be the general manager. And so Bill was the general manager at the station for several years. And of course, I'd known Bill for a long time because he'd been at KCAU forever. So it was real interesting to work for him and get to understand some of his relationships that he had with people, both at the network level and locally. And so it was a really great experience. Then Bill eventually retired a second time, because he'd actually already retired from KCAU. He retired a second time. And then, so once he was retired, and we had a new general manager, and we had a couple of general managers in there. Bill's the one who asked me would I be interested in going out to Rapid City. So because he was going to be one of the a minority partner, I think, in that station in Rapid City.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, let's see. What do I? There are very few locally owned stations. Maybe we're getting into a little kind of what I told you would be kind of some deep think questions here.
Yeah.
Very few locally owned stations anymore. In fact, I don't even know if there are. KCRG in Cedar Rapids was one of the few, and then they were sold to a chain not too long ago, a couple of years ago now. What happened here?
I would say, I mean, I don't have the definitive answer, but I think that one of the big things is just a kind of what you can get because you have a whole bunch of stations rather than just a few stations, in terms of things like centralization. If I can have, like, the Quincy stations had a central master control area. And so several of their stations were hubbed in Quincy, and there was a master control place in Quincy that would do that, and that could save money. And I think that's part of what's happening. You can have kind of a regional manager to oversee several stations, instead of having maybe an actual general manager at all of the stations. That could save some money. So I think that's part of it too. Of course, a lot of this changed in 1996 because of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 that changed ownership rules. Radio was the big thing there because all of a sudden, instead of just a few radio stations you could own, there was no limit to how many you could own. That's where, at the time, Clear Channel came to be and owned up to, I don't know, 1,500 stations at the time. So I think it's really just a thing of looking at, is it more efficient to run a bunch of stations than just to run one or two stations? Even in little things like, if I can buy programming for a bunch of different television, if I can buy a syndicated program for a bunch of television stations, I can probably get a better deal from that syndicator than if I'm just one station trying to buy that thing. So I think that's part of it too, which is part of why, the Quincy Broadcasting Group that had about 15 stations by the time they sold to Gray, just decided, this other organization can probably do this better, and it's time for us to get it kind of out of the business, because it was a family-owned business, even though they owned 15 or 16 stations. They just said, let's get out of this business, and Gray bought them. And so now in Sioux City, all of the TV stations here, we have an NBC, a CBS, an ABC, and a Fox station, are all basically owned by large companies like Gray Television, Sinclair, and Nexstar.
Mm-hmm. There's also some holding companies that have started buying stations. Do you know anything about that?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't have any experience with that. I don't know much about it. I know there are some names out there, that are basically, they're not traditional broadcast companies, but they are kind of holding companies. I know there are some of those out there. I don't know much about them.
Yeah, I don't either. There's the station I worked at in the Quad Cities was owned by a holding company for a little while and then was sold off. And I think that's what they do, just buy them and hold them and then sell them for profit. So, yeah. Well, this is kind of a big question, but how has the internet affected not only KTIV, but the industry? And there's lots of different ways, I know, but
lots of ways. And I have an interesting way of looking at this. So having come from the television business, when I came to Morningside, by the way, it's now Morningside University, not Morningside College. We changed a summer ago.
I apologize for that.
When I came to Morningside University, well, it was college at the time. One of the first things that I figured out in talking to students, so now I'm talking to, 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20-year-old students, is that most of them don't watch television on any kind of regular basis. They don't, this was in 2009 when I came to Morningside. They don't watch television on any kind of regular basis. They certainly don't read a newspaper. They don't listen to regular radio. So in my mind, I'm going, I just came from this business, this television business, that's going to have to change their business model, because these young people are going to expect to get everything they need on their phone. They're not going to sit down and watch a 6 o'clock news or a 10 o'clock news. And the business model for most television stations is get people to watch the 6 o'clock news or watch the 10 o'clock news. So as I started working on my master's degree, which I did while I was here at Morningside, the research that I did was, is there a market for local television news among younger people? And the answer is yes, but you have to figure out how to get to them. So I did that in 2012, 2013, when I was finishing my master's degree. And then in 2016, we reproduced that research with a group of students here at Morningside in a digital marketing class. And then just last summer, the summer of 2021, a student and I reproduced that research again, looking at how are young people getting news? And is there a potential audience for them, for traditional television stations, to be able to get them? And it's interesting that the student and I that worked on the research, again, we found out, yes, there are things you can do, but it's not that they're going to be turning in at 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock to watch the news, because they want to get news whenever they want to. And so part of what's interesting about this research is the student and I now have presented that research to all of the TV stations here in Sioux City. And we've said, here's what we've learned, which is you still have a real value in the community as a local television station, but you have to figure out other ways to get to them. And that might be using your Facebook page or using Twitter, or making sure that your website is updated with more news. And of course, everybody's doing that now. You know, almost all the major ownership groups have their own kind of streaming service that's available. Certainly all the ones that own stations here in Sioux City, they all have some kind of national streaming service that brings in local television stations. Stations haven't quite figured out how to make a whole lot of money out of that yet. But the amount of money stations are making from digital is gradually moving up, because the money that they're making from traditional television advertising is kind of moving down just a little bit, which is not to say there's not an audience for traditional television. There are still millions and millions of people who watch traditional television. It's just not the younger people, and they're not going to turn into that audience based on my research. So like I said, I have an interesting way of looking at this, having come from the business and now working with those young people.
You know, I think you can kind of tell that too when you watch the evening news, which of course I still consume a lot of news. All the commercials are for products that somebody in our age group are going to be more interested in.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What led you to teaching at Morningside? Why did you decide to get into teaching?
It wasn't a decision I made because I wanted to do that. So I was at KTIV. While I was at KTIV, people may remember that 2008 was a really terrible year for kind of everybody. That's when the housing thing started, and we talked about the major recession of 2008. And at the television station, we were trying to figure out how are we going to survive. And so my boss said, we need to come up with a list of some people that we might have to let go because we can't survive in this current market. I mean, if the recession is happening, meaning car dealers aren't selling cars, then they're going to stop advertising, as one little example. So we said, let's come up with a list of people we may need to let go. And then one day my boss came into my office, and he didn't live in our town, came into my office and said, thanks for putting that list together, but your job is being eliminated. So my job, after being at the station for 29 years, and the last 4 of which had been, in the corner office as the station manager, my job was gone, and, be gone by 4 o'clock tomorrow. And so that was a huge shock when you're working someplace for as long as I was, and thinking that that's probably where you retire from. But because I'd been in the media for so long in this and in the community in a lot of different ways, there was a story in the newspaper like a day later about me losing my job and the job going away. And I got a call from a friend of mine who worked at Morningside that said, well, the president of Morningside would like to talk to you. And I said, okay, so let's arrange a meeting to do that. And so I went to lunch with the president at the time. His name was John Reinders, the president of Morningside, and the vice president for academic affairs. And I'd met both of them, and I knew one of them a little bit more. And I went to lunch with them, and they said, we need somebody to come be the chair of our mass communication department. Would you have an interest in doing that? And I said, yes. So this was in December of 2008. And so basically I went for about a day and a half of not knowing what was going to happen. Because at the time I had kids that were either in college or thinking about going to college, and, was married and had a house and all those kind of things. And so it was a little bit of a bad 1.5 days until I had this meeting with the folks from Morningside. Interesting that they said, now this was December, they said, well, we're going to hire, eventually we got to the point, they said, we're going to hire you. But you can't start until the 1st of June, because that's when our new fiscal year starts. And I said, that's okay. I got severance from KTIV for leaving the position there. So it wasn't going to be a money issue. But it's funny but I couldn't really tell people about the job at that point. And so I got a call from another friend of mine who said, I don't know if you've found a job or anything, but I need somebody to do public relations for my nonprofit organization. And I said, well, I could maybe do that. And he said, but I can only pay you for 6 months. Well, all of a sudden I had 6 months of time available. And so it worked out just fine. So I was the public relations manager for Siouxland Mental Health Center for about 6 months before I then started at Morningside. It was Morningside College at the time, in the summer of 2009.
That worked out. Well,
it did.
Yes, and you're lucky it was only a day and a half, but at the time, I'm sure you had, as you said, you had no idea how long that was going to be. So
that's right.
Very disconcerting.
Yeah.
Along that line, TV especially is very cutthroat, broadcasting very cutthroat sometimes, especially in the news part of it, but also obviously in management. What do you tell kids about that? How do you feel about teaching them, working with them to get into a business that can be like that?
That specific issue hasn't really come up about being kind of cutthroat like that. What I can tell you is that most of the students, at least at Morningside right now, they're not thinking traditional journalism is something that they want to do. They're not thinking they want to go work at a newspaper or work at a television station. And I think a lot of it's because they don't see that. They don't watch television news. I always watched television news growing up because my parents did, and then I did, and I thought that'd be a cool thing to do, or write for a newspaper because I enjoyed writing and stuff. But the current students don't do that. And so part of what we have to talk to students about is what kinds of jobs are available still in our world of media. And that's changing a lot too. I mean, we talked earlier about the whole centralization thing, but it still means that there are local media opportunities, whether it's television or radio or newspaper or being a social media company. I'm having a guest come to a class here tomorrow that's going to talk about, she started a social media company about 10 years ago that 20 years ago, nobody would have ever thought about. I mean, who needed social media? Who knew what social media meant? Now, all of a sudden, she's got a very successful business. And so she's going to come talk to my media management class. So I think what part of our challenge is to talk to students about what are some potential things you can do if it's not working for a traditional television station or radio station. However, I can tell you, we have an advisory board that's made up of all of the media around here, plus some public relations people and that kind of thing. So we try to meet with them once a semester and have lunch with them and talk about what do they need. They still all need people to work there. The television stations are all looking for people. The radio stations are all looking for people. The newspaper is still looking for people. There are still jobs out there. I think we just have to now kind of introduce those jobs to some students because they don't know that those really exist.
Interesting. Well, let's talk about a few memorable moments from your career. One of them I think has to be, I'm sure there are many, but one of them has to be the Sioux City plane crash, I would think. back in '89.
Yep.
People who weren't familiar with that, well, I'll let you go ahead and tell it.
Sure. 1989, United Flight 232 was on its way between Denver and Chicago, and had a major hydraulic problem, which meant that the pilot could not control where the plane was going, couldn't turn the plane one way or the other. And so the pilot was saying, what are we going to do? And about the time they were nearing Sioux City, they said, maybe we can make an emergency landing at the Sioux City airport. Now, the Sioux City airport, unlike us, we're a small airport, really tiny little airport, but we have a relatively large runway because we have an Iowa Air National Guard unit at the airport. Mm-hmm. So we've had longer runways than normal at a smaller airport because we needed to handle those Air Guard planes. So they said, well, maybe we can land there and do an emergency landing. Because of the hydraulic system, the pilot couldn't actually make the plane go where he wanted specifically straight. He could only make turns in one direction. So he basically, from wherever he started circling around in big circles and made smaller and smaller circles until he could get close enough and try to land in Sioux City. And he did land in Sioux City, but in the landing, a wing touched the ground, which then caused the plane to kind of catapult around and burst into flames. A lot of people died, but many more people survived. And God, it just brings back memories. The reason people say so many people survived is because not very long before this happened, all of the emergency people in this area, and I don't mean just Sioux City, but the area around here, had training and exercises of what if there was a plane crash at the Sioux City airport. And they had just done this stuff. And so they kind of knew exactly what to do. And so emergency vehicles showed up at the airport. And like I said, pretty much everybody in town, the hospitals, of course, all immediately went into overdrive in terms of accepting patients. And it was really an amazing time. Now, from the television station standpoint, we had one of our reporter photographers went to the airport and happened to be in the right place at the right time to shoot video of the plane crashing. Nobody had ever actually had video of a commercial airliner crashing before. Mm-hmm. So here was something completely new for the whole airline industry to look at. We had this video and we showed it on television. And this was, when this actually happened, it was way before YouTube and things like that. So that's where you could get it, is you could watch a television station. We started getting calls from places all over the world. And that was my job, because it was kind of an all hands on deck thing. Everybody at the television station was going to be working, doing something. And one of my jobs, I was the program director at the time, was to talk to people who would call us and ask about getting that video. And could they get a copy of that video? And how could we get that to them? And could we make a copy and send it by FedEx? Or could we make a copy and send it via traditional phone lines, which is how we used to get our network signal, for example. And so, like I said, everybody was kind of working during those few hours of that happening in the next several days of the aftermath of that. And our footage became pretty famous around the world because nobody had ever seen that before. An actual, here is the plane actually crashing, and what did it look like? So it was an amazing experience. Sioux City we did a really great job. The city and the whole community around here did a really great job of handling that situation, which, like I said, is why they're giving credit for more people surviving than that died.
Thinking back to that, I know KCAU, I was in the Quad Cities by then, but KCAU didn't have a live truck. Did KTIV have a live truck then, or how did you get the video back?
It was just, the photographer was at the airport, shot the video, and then drove it back to the TV station. Yeah, because I don't think any of us had live trucks at the time.
Yeah. I don't
And then
think so.
drove it back to the TV station, where when we ended up putting a lot of the footage that was shot was put kind of raw on the air. It's just as soon as they got here, we'd do a special report and put it live on the air. And so that's how people first saw it, because there just weren't live trucks at the time. Not that our size stations would have had.
Any other memorable moments from either your professional or your teaching career that come to mind?
I've had so much fun here at the university. First of all, I teach a course that's called Introduction to Mass Communication. So it's kind of the course that all of the majors in mass communication are required to take. And we don't have that many majors at Morningside, but it also counts as a general education requirement. So a lot of students take it anyway. Like this semester, as we're doing this, it's the fall semester of 2022. I have 36 students in that class, but I think maybe 4 or 5 of them are majors in mass communication, and the rest of them are taking it because it counts as a general education requirement. Because for one reason, we talk about ethics, we talk about media ethics, and we require everybody to take at least one course that talks about ethics somehow. The university requires that. But also we have a general education requirement says you have to take a certain number of courses from some different areas. And ours is one of those areas that you have to take at least one course in. So a lot of students take it for that. So I teach that course, which is mostly freshmen, and I really love that. And it's in the fall, so it's the first time they've come to school. I really love working with the freshmen that way. I teach media management because that was almost my entire career in television was in media management. So I started that class when I first came here because they didn't have a class like that. I teach that every fall semester. I teach a public relations class in the spring semesters. I teach a little bit of video stuff. I oversee our radio station here because in our department, we only have 2 of us who are faculty members. We used to have 3. Our 3rd faculty member passed away several years ago, and he was kind of our radio guy, and we haven't been able to replace him yet. So I've taken over looking at the radio station and supervising that. So I'm just having a really good time, working with the students. And is there retirement in my future? Yeah. I don't know. It's not going to be this year. Maybe it's next year. But for right now, I'm having a good time doing this.
Sounds like that was one of my final questions. Was what was going to be up with you? Let me ask you one more. We've kind of talked about this sort of, but the future of broadcasting. We've hit on some different things that are happening now. Do you have any thoughts on, as we go further and further along, what's going to happen with broadcasting?
I think it's interesting because as I mentioned that having the folks at our advisory board, and we talk to them about what do they need for, new employees. And I also have a lot of folks that come in and talk to my media management class, for example, somebody who runs a radio station group, and somebody who's a general manager at a television station, and somebody who's does programming at a TV station, and the public radio folks and the newspaper folks. So I have all those folks come in, and almost all of them will agree that there's going to be a need for local journalism, local news into the future. It may not be in the same, they're going to have content to deliver. They may not deliver it the same way. It may be, instead of opening up a newspaper like I'm used to doing every day, instead of opening up a newspaper, they're going to provide that information on their website or through their Twitter feed or whatever, through the app that they have on your phone. And I think there may be some of that will happen in television also. I don't think there'll be quite as much in television because there'll always be a need, I think, for some of that, for the availability to do some live things, whether it's live news that's happening, like on the spot kind of breaking news stuff, or major events like the Super Bowl. I don't see those ever happening just on a streaming service, for example. Although I could be wrong. All of a sudden, you can just stream Thursday Night Football on a streaming service as opposed to on a television station. But I think, at least on the television side, I think there's always going to be a need for some kind of local broadcasting. It may just not be that the business model is completely based on eyeballs watching the television. And the same thing on the radio side. I think there'll always be kind of a need for that, even though there are things like Sirius XM that you can listen to anywhere in the country, or Pandora or Spotify. I still think there'll be an interest in local radio where there's actually live people there. And it's interesting because in the Sioux City market, we have one radio group that is almost completely on the live and local, where they have a lot of employees. And the other is an iHeartMedia group that has like 1.5 employees. And so they're both surviving, but the iHeartMedia one survives because they have this huge number of other stations and are able to do things that way. So things are going to change, but I think there's always going to be some jobs for students. One of the things I try to convince students is to think about sales. Nobody comes into broadcasting thinking I want to be in sales. But a whole lot of people find that sales is something that works well for them and that they can be very successful. I tell students, the people who drive the best cars, who make the most money at the TV stations or the radio stations or the newspapers, are probably salespeople. It's probably not the anchor person. It's probably not, the morning DJ. It's the people who go out and sell things. So I try to infuse a little bit of sales stuff into like my media management class, for example.
Okay. Is there any place else you think should you have a course on sales?
We actually used to have what we called a practicum. So it's just a 2-credit course that met just once a week. And I talked about media sales. But it was harder to get students to take it because, again, they didn't think that sales was something they needed to ever think about, even though several of the people that have taken that class in the past are now working as salespeople in our market even. So I just take some of that sales stuff because I taught that class and I put it into our media management class. So I still talk about sales, but I just don't know that you'd find enough interested students to have a full class about it.
Yeah. Dave, I think we're going to wind it up here pretty quick, but I wanted to give you a chance. Is there anything we didn't touch on that you might want to say?
Boy, I don't think so. It's been a really great time for me to be in this area of kind of broadcasting, even though I'm not technically, well, I guess I am because I oversee the radio station. And our student radio station is a regular full-time 24 hours a day broadcast licensed radio station as a non-commercial educational station. But it's been a really great experience for me in all these years. And like I said, originally coming to Sioux City thinking, I would stay here a year or two, and now I've been here since 1976. So I think another thing we can suggest to young people is it's okay to go work in a smaller market, and you never know what you're going to find. You might find something that keeps your interest enough to keep you in that community and not just thinking, well, I really only need to go work in Chicago, or I really need to go work at ESPN. So I think that's another challenge for us, is to tell students it's okay to stay in a smaller market.
Well, Dave, this has been fun. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for taking some time with us here.
Absolutely. It's been really great talking to you, Cliff.
Yeah. So I'm Cliff Brockman with Dave Madsen, and Paul Yeager of Iowa Public Television was our producer today. Thanks again, Dave.
You bet. Thank you very much.